chills. Number 4. The CIA loves LSD. More commonly known on the streets as acid, LSD is a psychedelic drug that causes colorful hallucinations and intense thought patterns in its users. In the early 1950s, way before anyone knew about the drug, the American government was busy conducting its own LSD research, and they weren't afraid to use the unwilling public as test subjects. The Central Intelligence Agency was put in charge of a program called MK Ultra. Their goal was to see if they could use LSD for various forms of mind control. More specifically, they were thinking of using it as a truth serum, or to wipe clean an agent's mind after they retire, or even as a way to get people to obey commands. MK Ultra had one experiment in particular called Operation Midnight Climax. For this operation, the CIA rented apartments in San Francisco and New York and made them look like brothels. Then they paid prostitutes $100 a night in return for luring clients back to the apartments and putting LSD into their drinks. Sometimes they were told to smoke marijuana instead. The entire time, the CIA watched and recorded the client's every move through a one-way mirror. This went on all the way until 1964, when the last CIA outpost was quietly closed down. Another part of Operation Midnight Climax focused on government infiltration. For this experiment, CIA agents would pose as members of certain activist groups and drug them with LSD so they could study their reactions. At one point, the CIA even hired professional stage magicians to show Secret Service agents the best ways to slip LSD into someone's beverage without being detected. By the end of the operation, the United States government had used taxpayer money to make thousands of people take psychedelic drugs against their will. Number 3. The Young Prisoner. Graham Young was a scrawny teenager living just outside of London in the 1960s who was very bitter about life. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was less than 3 months old. During this time, his grieving father sent him to live with his aunt, a relative who he never bonded with. When his father finally remarried and took Graham back home, the boy hated his stepmother more than anyone he had ever hated before. This lack of affection would become what allows Graham to later experiment on his entire family and countless others without feeling any pity or remorse. Graham receives a chemistry kit and spends most of his time alone studying his two favorite subjects, chemistry and Nazi history. No doubt Nazi experiments are what helps inspire him to go on multiple poisoning sprees soon after. His first victim is his only childhood friend, Christopher Williams. As they eat lunch together, Graham sneaks poison into his friend's sandwiches almost every day. It wasn't long after before Christopher began vomiting, having severe headaches, running a fever, and missing school all of the time from feeling exhausted. Doctors thought he was simply suffering from a severe and prolonged case of the flu and didn't think much more of it. One day, while Christopher is sick from school, he and Graham go to the zoo together. Under the guise of friendship, Graham brings with him some poisoned lemonade and lets Christopher have it. His friend survives but continues to suffer. Graham is only 13 years old at this point. He enjoys poisoning Christopher as often as he can get away with, but it just wasn't often enough to satisfy his sick urges. He needed to go even further. He needed test subjects that he could constantly monitor, so he puts poison into family meals. He only poisons certain sections of the meal and saves the untainted pieces for himself. Graham is able to get a hold of the poison he needs by charming local chemists, using his expert knowledge to put them at ease. He explains that he was a harmless young scientist himself and needs ingredients to experiment with. Sometimes he would even convince them that he was a college student so that they would sign the release forms, giving him access to a steady supply of poison. The poison Graham was using was called antimony, and it was used in the 60s to make batteries and other common products. It can be used in powder form to easily poison someone. At first, it causes fever, vomiting, and other symptoms resembling the flu. Over time, through repeated exposures, it causes hair loss and kills the nerve endings. As they slowly suffer, Graham's victims often experience numbness that starts in the fingers and progresses into hot shooting pains throughout the body. As you can probably already tell, Graham has a twisted yet scientific mind. He keeps detailed logs the entire time as his family becomes sicker and sicker around him. Each entry contains the dosage of the poison and its effect. For example, if his mother starts to vomit, he would write how many grams it took to cause that reaction. His family eventually realizes they are being poisoned, but they did not suspect it was intentional. Instead, they believe Graham had accidentally contaminated some of their kitchen utensils by using them for his chemistry experiments, and that was why they were all becoming so violently ill. Graham especially targets his stepmother, Molly, who he had hated since childhood. Over the course of a year, he gives her small doses to torture her stomach and takes enormous pleasure in her suffering. In April 1962, Graham's father discovers his wife rolling around in pain in the garden. From the window, Graham watches the scene unfold. His father looks up and the two lock eyes. He notices his son seems to have absolutely no emotion. At the hospital, doctors could not understand Molly's symptoms. She says she wants to go home and cook dinner. Hours later, she is dead. Graham could stop there, but his compulsions did not let him. He tortures his grief-stricken family even further with more poison, keeping detailed logs of his human experiments all the while. His father and sister both would eventually have permanent liver damage from his cruelty. Graham begins to especially focus on his father's misery. There is no reason for him to do this other than a morbid fascination with death. From all records, his father had never especially wronged him, but he decided to poison him more than the others. While his father is at the hospital one day for flu-like symptoms, doctors begin to suspect it to be a poisoning. As the doctors wonder out loud what poison it could have been, Graham begins to lecture them. His expertise on the subjects frightens everybody, including his father, and also made them suspicious. One day, as Graham is busy making his family's lives miserable, his chemistry teacher finds the poison he uses in the boys' desk during class. He calls Graham's family doctor, who calls a psychiatrist, who goes with the police to interview Graham. They act like they are simply interested with his impressive knowledge of chemistry and give no indication that he is a suspect in a murder case. Graham shows off his knowledge of poisonous chemicals, and police are convinced enough to arrest him. At age 14, he is sentenced to 15 years at Broadmoor Psychiatric Facility. During his stay, he uses soap and anything else he can find to poison those around him. He even extracts cyanide from a Laurel brush to kill one inmate. Even after confessing his murder to the staff, they do not believe him and list it as a suicide. Being a clever young man, he is eventually able to convince the staff that he is rehabilitated and is released very early at the age of 23. As a free citizen, Graham decides to continue experimenting on people with poisons. Thallium is his new chemical element of choice. This is a heavy metal that was used in the photography industry back then to manufacture camera lenses. Before that, it was a type of rat poison. Thallium is odorless, colorless, tasteless, and easily dissolves in water. The perfect poison. Using a glowing reference from Broadmoor, Graham finds a job at one of the only two factories in the entire country that stocks the poison he needs. Shortly after starting work, at least 10 of his peers begin to suddenly suffer from a mystery illness. The ones closest to him seem to get the sickest. Bob Eagle seems to be his favorite target. The poor associate has stomach pains and numbness throughout his body and hallucinates for 2 months. When he goes to the hospital, doctors can't figure it out. He describes his ailments to Graham the entire time, who pretends to be his friend while dutifully taking notes in his journal. When Bob dies, Graham convinces his widow to cremate the body to hide all of the evidence. Fred Biggs becomes the next co-worker to be targeted the most. He dies the same way shortly after. At this point, there have been 2 deaths and all of the workers are quite alarmed. A doctor investigates the workplace and concludes that it was a flu virus that claimed their lives. But when Graham begins asking the doctor too many questions, he arouses suspicion from his co-workers. He actually mentions the possibility of thallium poisoning. His co-workers contact the police, and criminal investigators start looking into his past. When they find out about his history of poisoning, they raid his house for evidence. There, among Nazi paraphernalia, is the poison and the scientific journal. Just like before with his family, it lists all of Graham's co-workers, their dosages, and the effects. For these crimes, Graham was sentenced to life in prison. During the proceedings, he never apologized and said that he felt only emptiness. If anything, however, he desperately wanted to be remembered. A note that he passed to a courtroom journalist asked to make him famous for his crimes. He died in 1990 at the age of 42. Many believe that he poisoned himself for one last hurrah.
It didn't matter who his victims were, whether it was family, workmates, school friends, they were just guinea pigs to him.
He was very dark, somewhat glum.
Number 2, the Scientific Sadist. To the outside world, Bob Berdella was a strange fellow who owned a store full of oddities called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. Customers thought that he was full of himself and smelled weird. He thought he was an excellent person for bringing culture into the dull area of Kansas City. His private life, however, was much more twisted and horrifying than any of the merchandise he sold. One day, Berdella picks up a male drug addict and promises to give him prescription drugs at his house. When they get there, he ties the victim, who remains nameless for privacy's sake, to his bed. There, he tortures him endlessly. Berdella starts by shocking the man's genitals with wire cables, while he snaps away pictures to pleasure himself to later. He does not stop until the victim pretends to pass out. Berdella puts a burlap sack over his head and walks out of the room. He comes back, viciously beats him around the head with an iron bar, and leaves again. When Berdella comes back a third time, he injects a needle full of Drano into his throat. Berdella does this to try and dissolve the vocal cords so his victims could no longer scream. Next, he takes Q-tips soaked in bleach and dabs his victim's eyes. The victim later recalls how the burning pain was unbearable and his eyes swelled shut. Each time Berdella left the room, it was probably to make another entry in his journal of human torture experiments. This was not his first victim. Berdella had a lot of experience. He enjoyed torturing young men to death and documenting their reactions in a notebook. In this journal, he made up his own code of vulgar acronyms that reference everything he did to them, and even what positions he abused them in. This is so that he could read over them later and relive the torture in his head again and again without missing any details. The torture acts involved everything from grocery store produce to electricity. He even once tried to rip a man's eye out just to see what it felt like. In total, 47 people were reported missing from 1984 to 1988, and Berdella seems responsible for most of them. Over the next few days, Berdella tends to his victims' injuries. The poor man drifts in and out of consciousness for days, drugged up on animal tranquilizers, blinded and barely able to speak. The entire time Berdella keeps the television up so loud that it is impossible to tell if he is still in the room or not. The man has to sit and listen in constant fear of his torturer returning. After 4 days of being tied to a bed, the victim convinces Berdella to tie the ropes differently. Berdella listens, and later his victim is able to manipulate the knots just enough to have a limited degree of reach. On the 5th day, he is able to grab a nearby pack of matches and uses them to burn the ropes off. By now, his eyes have healed enough to be able to see again, and he looks down from the window. Berdella has vicious guard dogs in his backyard below, so the victim opens the window and begins to slowly creep along the ledge. The ledge breaks, but fortunately he falls into an area where the dogs aren't able to get him. Completely naked, the only person to escape Berdella's lair alive heads straight to authorities, who quickly arrest him. After his arrest, the county hires a real estate agent to evaluate how much his home is worth. The real estate agent describes seeing gigantic guard dogs in cages in the backyard, and also seeing unsettling paintings of people screaming throughout the home. Worst of all was the kitchen. It was very plain and had 2 large stainless steel tables in the center to dismember bodies on. One of the tables even had a sink with a gigantic industrial garbage disposal that no person would ever ordinarily have a use for. Bob Berdella died of a heart attack in prison in 1992.
Talk about the torture pretty much, because, I was away through most of that. It's one time when he hooked these cables up to my...
Number 1. Japan's human experiments. During World War II, Japan figured they could win by using the types of biological weapons that had been banned from wartime use. Unit 731 was the name for a bioweapon research unit that ignored all of the rules. When Japan invaded a portion of China in the 1930s, Unit 731 sets up research posts for some of the most horrible human experiments to ever be recorded. In the beginning, Unit 731 claims to exist to help the public combat disease, but really they are conducting atrocities on prisoners of war. For example, 40 Japanese medical doctors are led to a jail one day. Here they find 2 prisoners with their hands tied behind their backs. The prisoners are shot in the stomach twice. After that, the doctors are divided into teams in order to remove the bullets, without giving the prisoners any painkillers or anesthesia. While this happens, other doctors are practicing battlefield amputations while others are still cutting into their windpipes for another surgical maneuver. The human experiments are literally ripped apart while alive. Other experiments tested the effects of frostbite to see if there was a way to reverse it once it settled in. To achieve this, human test subjects are placed outside in freezing weather with their arms and legs exposed. Guards would march by and throw freezing water onto their limbs to quicken the process until they became black with frostbite. Then they were put in pools of water at different temperatures to see if they could regain feeling and control of their extremities. Many died from illness, froze to death, or could not withstand the shock of losing a limb. Ceramic bombs, cluster bombs, and bombs with plague-infected fleas were also tested as well. For this, human experiment victims were tied to stakes at fixed positions to measure the effectiveness of the bombs at different blast radiuses. Those who did not die right away suffered in agony, hung up on a post to scream and plead until their injuries turned fatal. Other experiments dealt with the effects of pressure. Humans were placed in a pressure chamber and the pressure was slowly turned up until their eyes exploded from their skulls. Prisoners aside, local populations were not safe from Unit 731 either. Researchers had an airplane to spray anthrax, plague, cholera, and other contaminants over villagers and towns. After the community slowly and painfully died, Unit 731 researchers would examine the dead bodies and take notes to see which weapons were the most lethal. Between 300 and 580,000 people are thought to have died this way. As the end of World War II came to a close, Unit 731 became more and more desperate in their experiments. They had one operation in particular, codenamed Cherry Blossoms at Night, which planned to use plague-infested pilots to spread disease across America. These planes were planned to dive bomb the coast of California, but the event never happened. When the war finally came to an end, Unit 731 attempted to dynamite all of the evidence of their wrongdoings, but plenty of the gruesome information was still discovered. The prisoners, however, were massacred using poisonous gas and machine gun fire. Those who were still standing were thrown into the river to drown. Nobody was left alive to be rescued. Thanks for checking out this video. Please consider subscribing because we upload a new scary countdown every week. My name is Chills and my Twitter is at YTChills and my Instagram is at DylanIsChillinYT. I'd really appreciate a follow and feel free to send me a DM if you have any comments or suggestions. See ya.